The rain that night on 125th Street wasn't washing anything away. It was just making the pavement slick, turning the neon lights of the club fronts into blurred, bleeding watercolors on the asphalt. It was 3 in the morning, the kind of hour where the city holds its breath, waiting for a violence it knows is coming. Inside the precinct, the air was stale, smelling of wet wool, cheap tobacco, and the nervous sweat of men who knew they were outmatched. They had him in the box. Again. They had slammed the heavy steel door shut an hour ago. The sound had echoed down the hallway like a gunshot, a definitive metallic clamor that was supposed to signal the end. The district attorney was pacing in the observation room, his tie loosened, a triumphant smirk fighting through the fatigue on his face. He looked at the captain and nodded. They had the ledgers. They had the witness, a shivering kid from frantic streets who had seen too much and said too little until they squeezed him. They had the man himself, sitting on the other side of that two-way mirror. But inside the interrogation room, there was no fear, there was no pacing, there was no sweat on the brow of the man in the charcoal suit. He sat perfectly still. His hands were folded on the table, not clenched, just resting, as if he were waiting for a dinner reservation rather than a 20-year sentence. He didn't look at the mirror. He didn't look at the door. He stared at a scuff mark on the table, his face a mask of terrifying, absolute calm. The silence in that room was louder than the sirens outside. It was a heavy, physical thing. The detectives wanted him to scream, to lawyer up, to demand a phone call. He did none of it. He just breathed. Slow. Even. Because while they were celebrating in the hallway, slapping backs and talking about headlines, they didn't hear the hum of a machine that didn't need an operator to keep spinning. 3 blocks away, a bag of cash was being dropped into a laundry chute. 2 miles north, a shipment was being diverted to a warehouse in the Bronx. A phone rang in a judge's study and was answered on the first ring. The man in the chair checked his watch. He wasn't checking the time of his incarceration. He was timing the collapse of their case. He knew something they didn't. He knew that you can lock up a man, you can put chains on flesh and bone, but you cannot handcuff a ghost. And by the time the sun came up, the DA's smirk would be gone, replaced by the cold realization that they hadn't caught the King of Harlem. They were just guests in his waiting room. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history books will tell you about the arrests. They will show you the mugshots, the black and white photos of a man in a fedora being led into a paddy wagon, surrounded by flashing bulbs and shouting reporters. They will list the charges: conspiracy, narcotics, racketeering. They will tell you that the law came down hard, over and over again. But what the history books, the court transcripts, and the FBI files never fully explain, what they were perhaps too embarrassed to admit, is why it never mattered. They erased the reality of what happened in those gaps between the handcuffs and the release. They want you to believe that crime is chaos, that it requires a dictator barking orders every second to keep the wolves at bay. But the man they called Bumpy had built something far more dangerous than a gang. He hadn't just built an organization, he had built an ecosystem. A system so intricate, so redundant, and so loyal that removing the head didn't kill the body, it just made the body more aggressive. This isn't a story about a man escaping prison. This is the story of how a man turned his own absence into a weapon, and how the city of New York spent millions of dollars trying to destroy a shadow. But before we understand the mechanics of the machine, we have to understand the burden of the architect. Imagine the weight of a silence that screams. Before he was a legend, before the nickname Bumpy commanded fear from Italian mob bosses and corrupt beat cops alike, he was a man who understood vulnerability better than anyone. He knew that the streets of Harlem were a living thing, a hungry thing. He had seen strong men, men with muscles like iron and tempers like fire, get swallowed whole because they thought strength was enough. He saw them shout, he saw them fight, and he saw them die. He realized early on that the loudest man in the room is usually the first one to bleed. The fear he felt wasn't a fear of death, it was a fear of irrelevance. It was the fear of building something that could be toppled by a single gust of wind. He spent nights staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster, wrestling with a terrifying equation. How do you rule a world that is designed to destroy you? How do you create permanence in a life defined by instability? The pressure wasn't about making money. Anyone with a gun and a lack of morals could make money. The pressure was about survival, not just his own, but the survival of the people who depended on him. The soup kitchens, the rent parties, the college tuitions paid in crumpled bills. If he fell, they starved. That was the moral struggle that kept him awake. It wasn't just crime, it was governance, and governance requires a system that outlives the governor. So he began to recede. He stopped being the fist and started being the mind. You wouldn't see him on the corner collecting envelopes. You wouldn't see him breaking fingers in the back of a pool hall. Those were the actions of amateurs. Instead, you felt him. He became a whisper in the barber shops, a nod from a doorman, a sudden hush when a black sedan turned the corner. He realized that if he wanted to be untouchable, he had to be invisible. He had to make sure that his power didn't rely on his physical presence. He started testing his own people. He would disappear for days, hiding in plain sight in a brownstone on Strivers Row, just to see if the money still came in, just to see if the orders were still followed. And when they were, when he saw that the fear of disappointing him was stronger than the opportunity to steal from him, he knew he was ready. He wasn't building a gang anymore. He was building a religion. And in this religion, the God didn't need to be seen to be feared. The police didn't understand this shift. To them, he was just another thug who had gotten lucky. They watched him. They tailored their suits to look like his. They smoked the same cigars, thinking they could get inside his head. They tracked his movements, noting every meeting, every handshake. But they were watching the performance, not the play. Every 60 seconds in Harlem, money changed hands. From the numbers runners to the bankers, from the bankers to the lieutenants, from the lieutenants to the safe houses. The police thought that if they cut the line, the flow would stop. So they started the raids. It was a Tuesday in November when they decided to make their first big statement. They hit 3 locations simultaneously. Sledgehammers against wood, glass shattering, men dragged out into the cold rain. They arrested his top 3 lieutenants. They confiscated $40,000 in cash, a fortune in those days. The captain of the precinct called a press conference. He stood before the microphones, chest puffed out, and declared that the Johnson Empire had been dealt a fatal blow. He said the head of the snake had been severed from the body. What he didn't know was that the snake had grown 2 new heads before the first handcuff clicked. Bumpy was sitting in a jazz club when the news broke. He was listening to a saxophone player lean into a low, mournful note. He didn't run. He didn't scramble to a phone booth. He signaled the waiter for another drink, because he knew that the money the police had seized was the decoy money. He knew the lieutenants they arrested had been briefed 3 months ago on exactly what to do in this scenario. They had lawyers waiting before they were even booked. Their families had envelopes delivered to their doors within the hour, ensuring their silence. The system hadn't broken. It had just shifted gears. The routes changed. The pickup times were altered by 15 minutes. The codes spoken over the telephone lines switched from a discussion about horse racing to a discussion about laundry. The police were playing checkers, capturing pieces one by one, thinking they were winning. Bumpy was playing chess, and he was willing to sacrifice a knight to save the queen. But the law is a persistent animal. Humiliated by the lack of collapse, they focused entirely on him. If the organization wouldn't break, they would break the man. They arrested him for everything: loitering, disorderly conduct, a suspicion of conspiracy. They would pick him up on a Friday afternoon just to keep him in a cell over the weekend, knowing he couldn't see a judge until Monday. They wanted to disrupt his rhythm. They wanted to show Harlem that their king was a prisoner. This is where everything changed. This is where the strategy moved from brilliance to genius. Bumpy realized that the arrests were actually an asset. Every time they put him in cuffs, his legend grew. Every time he walked out of that precinct, straightening his tie, looking unbothered, the people saw him as invincible. He turned the jail cell into an office. He established a communication network that would baffle modern intelligence agencies. It involved cleaner women, lawyers, corrupt guards, and cryptic notes passed inside hollowed-out cigarettes. He memorized the entire operation. He kept no written records that mattered. The ledger was in his head. When he was inside, the organization actually ran tighter. The fear of making a mistake while the boss was away made his underlings hyper-efficient. They knew he was sitting in a cell, thinking, analyzing, remembering. There was a moment years into this war that defined the futility of the police effort. It was the siege of 1957, though the papers didn't call it that. The feds were involved now. They had bugged the phones. They had tails on every car. They decided to squeeze him until he popped. They arrested him on a narcotics charge that carried a life sentence. This was it, the real thing, no bail. Harlem held its breath. The streets went quiet. The competition, the Italians down in East Harlem, the upstarts in Brooklyn, they started to sharpen their knives. They thought the vacuum was finally opening. They thought the territory was up for grabs. Weeks turned into months. Bumpy was in federal custody. The trial was approaching. The prosecutors were confident. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence. But as they prepared their opening statements, they started noticing something strange on the streets. The drug flow hadn't slowed down. The numbers game hadn't missed a single payout. The disputes on the street were still being settled, not with gunfights, but with the word. Bumpy says. That phrase held more weight from a prison cell than a judge's gavel did from the bench. His lieutenants weren't fighting for power. They were executing a will that seemed to transcend the walls of the penitentiary. The police couldn't understand it. Who was giving the orders? Who was moving the money? They dragged in his wife, Mamie. They dragged in his driver. They interrogated the shoeshine boy on the corner. They got nothing. Silence. Not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of discipline. Bumpy had created a decentralized command structure decades before the military coined the term. Every man knew his job, and only his job. If one man fell, the man beneath him stepped up, knowing exactly what to do because he had been watching for years. The payoff of this long, grueling game was approaching. The trial began. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and anticipation. The prosecutor laid out the case, painting Bumpy as a mastermind of destruction. Bumpy sat there, his eyes heavy, looking like a tired businessman. He let them talk. He let them build their tower of words. He knew that the witness they were relying on, a low-level dealer named Red, wasn't going to show. Not because Red was dead. Bumpy didn't kill witnesses if he could avoid it. It was too messy, brought too much heat. No, Red wasn't going to show because Red had been reminded that his grandmother lived in a building Bumpy owned, and that the rent had been paid for the last 10 years by Bumpy's generosity. Red had simply taken a bus to Chicago. Without the witness, the case was a skeleton without bones. The judge, frustrated, banging his gavel, had to dismiss the primary charges. Bumpy stood up. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He buttoned his jacket. He nodded to the judge, a gesture of mock respect that stung more than an insult. He walked out of the courthouse and onto the steps. The flashbulbs erupted like a lightning storm. The reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, how do you beat them every time? Is the system rigged?" He paused. He looked at the cameras, then looked past them, towards the skyline of Harlem in the distance. He didn't shout. He spoke in a voice that forced everyone to lean in. "The law was made for men," he said softly. "I'm just a problem they haven't solved yet." He got into his car and drove away. The police stood on the sidewalk, impotent, furious, watching the taillights fade. They had arrested the man, but they had failed to arrest the idea. The legend of that acquittal spread like wildfire. It wasn't just that he beat the case, it was that the system never flinched while he was gone. The Italians, who prided themselves on organization, were stunned. They sent emissaries to Harlem, not to threaten, but to learn. "How do you do it?" they asked. "How do you keep the count right when you're in the cage?" Bumpy never told them. He knew that the secret wasn't in the mechanics, it was in the loyalty. He had bought loyalty not just with money, but with dignity. He treated his soldiers like men, not pawns. He protected their families. He paid for their funerals. He created a social contract in a world that had none. Years later, when he was an old man, watching the world change, watching the heroin epidemic tear apart the very community he had ruled, he sat on a park bench, feeding pigeons. A young hustler, flashy, loud, wearing too much gold, sat down next to him. The boy knew who Bumpy was, everyone did, but he didn't understand him. "They say you were the king," the boy said, arrogant. "But you spent half your life in chains. What kind of king is that?" Bumpy stopped feeding the birds. He looked at the boy with eyes that had seen the inside of every major prison in New York.